Now that Canadian mining firms are abusing their staff, hurting the environment, and no one is stopping them. It's not happening in this country. Instead, allegations are coming from the developing world. Today, a private member's bill that would give Ottawa more power over these companies, over how these companies do business overseas, was debated in committee. Joining me now is the MP who introduced the bill, Ontario Liberal John McKay. He's here. Good to see you, Mr. McKay. Also joining me is Carlo Dade. He's the Executive Director of the Canadian Foundation for the Americas. Good to see you. Mr. McKay, let's start with you. What exactly are you calling for with this private member's bill?
Well, it's actually quite a modest bill when you look at it. What we are asking for is, in the event that a Canadian company, is outside of compliance with pretty well recognized corporate social responsibility standards, that the minister be empowered to investigate that, make a finding, and if the finding is a negative finding, then the Government of Canada would withdraw its financing through EDC, and the pensioners of Canada would be asked to withdraw any investments through CPP.
And what motivated this? I mean, we know there are stories that the media of various Canadian companies who have been fighting various battles with environmental companies. There's certainly a case in Mexico of a gold mining company that had to stop mining for gold, recently because of some concerns about an environmental legislation. So, what prompted this private member's bill?
You can go through Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, over to a number of African countries, into the Philippines, into Papua New Guinea, and there's an enormous number of complaints about the activities of Canadian mining companies. Today's testimony, for instance, was by the former Environment Minister for Argentina, and she said that a Canadian mining company intimidated her family, firebombed their office, and has ultimately resulted in a legislation that she was passing to be repealed. These are pretty serious allegations.
Those are big allegations.
These are very serious allegations. We had a person from the Catholic Church there today as well, making very serious allegations by the activities in the Congo.
So Carlo Dade, I mean, do Canadians and does the government need to hold these companies to greater accountability given the reports that we hear, or not?
Another question, too, is whether or not the legislation will have positive impacts in terms of not just Canadian investment and Canadian companies, but on the development impacts that companies have. So does the government need to become more involved in this? I think you have to weigh the pluses and the minuses. There's a lot of good that comes from foreign investment. You want to encourage the positive aspects of it and the positive benefits without overly scaring Canadian companies.
But are you saying that this private member's bill, if passed, would hurt Canadian investment? And, the mining industry is a significant industry. Would it would hurt that industry? It
would hurt competitiveness, I would argue, and I don't think it would contribute much in terms of positive impacts on the ground. Canadian mining companies and getting funding for mining requires commercial financing, EDC or banks. Most banks already follow the Equator Principles, so we already have a fairly robust set of, if you like to call it, social investment, CSR, environmental safeguards in place that Canadian companies are already adhering to. What we're putting on is another layer on top of that, and one that's a bit more unpredictable.
John?
Well, with greatest respect, good CSR is good for business. Good business is good CSR.
CSR, corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, corporate social responsibility. Right. And I think we would probably agree on that point. But there are allegations out there, and the allegations keep on piling up. And with greatest respect, all that the taxpayer is asking is, in the event that the taxpayer is being asked to invest through EDC, that they should have a regime of accountability and transparency, because Canadians would like to know whether, in fact, we do have those kinds of investments. Similarly with the Canada Pension Plan, our pensioners would like to know whether, in fact, there are these kinds of these allegations are factual.
I mean, and I would argue that we have a regime in place with the Equator Principles.
But is it self-enforcing, or should the government step in to actually have a bigger stick over the mining companies, Carlo?
I think that The equator principles work very well. They're adopted by the IFC.
Explain what they are.
The equator principles are a set of principles for engagement by extractive companies, behavior, norms that are
But it's self-regulating, right?
It's regulated by the financing entities that provide the loans, a set of standards that are agreed across the board. And I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The equator principles have worked very well. And if there are serious problems with them, it may be more efficient, and from a competitive standpoint for Canadian companies, more efficient to look at addressing issues with the equator principles, which all companies, Canadian and others,
okay, go ahead.
The proof is in the pudding and the eating, and so if you listen to today's testimony, here we have a former environment minister of the country of Argentina saying, please pass C-300, because it enables her, because she knows that if Canada passes this legislation, she therefore has an ability to enforce Argentine law.
Okay, so Carlo, how do you hear that kind of someone of that stature coming in? How do you respond to her?
I have a former environment minister from Chile, actually a mining minister, who was saying that the advent of Canadian mining companies in Chile was one of the best things that happened to mining in Chile. Drastic improvements in the way mining companies acted and behaved. You know, we hear the stories of the damage that mining companies do, and I don't, with all due respect, I don't denigrate those stories. There are serious problems. There are Neanderthal companies that simply don't get it. The times have changed and business has moved on. But there are examples of Canadian companies doing well. A Canadian mining company is the only private sector recipient of the World Bank's World Development Marketplace Award for Innovation and Development. So there are positives as well as negatives.
And the last word to you, but do the negatives that Carlo's saying do the negatives require this greater legislation?
Well, regrettably, we passed legislation for the purpose for the purposes of creating regulation. I mean, to quote Madison, "If all men were angels, we wouldn't need laws." So that's our. So we've got a number of egregious circumstances, and these egregious circumstances, frankly, are driving this legislation.
John McKay, Carlo Day, thanks so much for coming in to talk about this private members bill. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
All right.